Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. The governments and people have something in common. Yes, yeah.
And just as if you took all of Ford Motor Company's operations and stuck them on one island, and made Henry Ford the dictator of that island, who controlled production in order to sell cars elsewhere, that wouldn't make that island socialist. You would have state ownership in that island, you would have economic planning in that island, but Tony Cliff's point was that that doesn't make socialism. And that's the key point of state capitalism. And this was also further affirmation of the point that Lenin and Trotsky had always repeated throughout the Russian Revolution, which was that you can't have socialism in one country. The Russian Revolution couldn't survive if it was isolated and forced to compete with the West. And so the theory of state capitalism helps us to provide a Marxist explanation of how Stalin rose to power and of the crimes he perpetrated. Right, so I just think it's worth pointing out the Russian Revolution was one of the most democratic episodes in human history. Workers took control of production on a massive scale. Workers took control of the country. But what happened was during the Civil War, during the foreign invasion, much of Russia's working class had been killed, had fled to the countryside. The Bolsheviks who had led the revolution were most likely to volunteer to fight in the Red Army, were most likely to be the brave fighters, were most likely to die on the front. And Stalin gave conscious expression to the aspirations of these bureaucrats. He said, the international revolution has failed. Forget international socialism. Let's remould the Communist International into a support organisation for Soviet foreign policy. Let's remould the Russian economy into something that can compete with, can catch up, can overtake the West. And the collectivisation of the farms that then took place in the late 20s and the 30s, that was the state asserting control over the economy of the countryside. Actually, it should be seen as analogous, really, to the enclosures that took place in Britain in the 16th century, to the Highland clearances that took place later in Scotland. It was about converting self-sufficient peasants into wage labourers, converting the population into people with nothing to sell but their labour power, which is what capitalism needs. And the removal of peasants from their land has been a brutal process in most countries where it's taken place. But it's never happened quite so quickly as under Stalin. He achieved what had taken Britain 3 centuries, proletarianisation on a massive scale, industrialisation on a massive scale, in under a decade. So the pain was magnified 100-fold, and millions died in the famines that followed. But he'd done this in order to compete in international capitalism. But despite everything that happened, despite the Civil War, despite the famines, the Russian working class had been through revolution, they had the memory of revolution, it was still there, and Stalin, if he was to take control of the economy, had to destroy it. So he murdered almost all the old leaders of the Bolshevik Party. He locked up millions in gulags. He created an atmosphere of state terror. Right? So there was a counter-revolution, in other words, in Russia, and Stalin led it. Now Trotsky had argued that you couldn't argue that Russia would drift back to capitalism because this would be like rewinding the tape of reformism. Because if something could drift from socialism to capitalism, why couldn't capitalism drift to socialism? It's a reformist argument in reverse, it said, in the late 30s. But if you could only bring about... There was a vicious and bloody class war in Russia, is the point. The working class's ability to fight had been destroyed, but it had been destroyed over a decade. It had been destroyed over the years of civil war, of famine, of poverty. Now, capitalist revolutions, actually, unlike socialist revolutions, because they're in the interests of a minority, not the majority, have taken place from above. The development in Germany in the late 19th century, for example. So for the working class to take power, Cliff argued, that requires a revolution. But what happened in Russia was that class was bled practically to death, and so Stalin was able to assert capitalist control over the Soviet Union and enact the first 5-year plan in 1928. And there was a vicious counter-revolution. But by describing Stalin's crimes as a state capitalist counter-revolution, motivated by competition with the West, by this theory of state capitalism, the point is, the small group of international socialists around Tony Cliff were able to navigate through the Cold War period and grow and do well. They were able to avoid 2 traps. They felt no need to defend Stalin's crimes, no need as socialists to defend the gulags, the nuclear bomb, the crushing of dissent in Eastern Europe, the whipping up of Tsarist nationalism and anti-Semitism in order to fight the Second World War and so on. There's no need to defend that. It's got nothing to do with socialism. But they also managed to avoid, because we understood that this was state capitalism, the temptation to explain these crimes away with bland statements like inside every revolutionary there's a policeman. That's just what always happens. Or everyone who seizes power is all the same. Or by the biographical psychobabble you sometimes get, like Stalin was bullied at school and that's why there were gulags. We're able to materially explain this stuff because we understood this was about capitalist competition with the West. And so the International Socialists felt there was no need to abandon revolutionary socialism and no need to support the West in the Cold War. Our slogan became neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism.
Yes.